Ahmad ibn Fadlan traveled far from Baghdad. He was a scholar, a diplomat, sent by the Caliph in 921 to the Bulgars of the Middle Volga River. But on his journey in the year 922, he met a different people. He met the Russes. These were Scandinavian traders, Vikings, who had come down the great rivers of the east. And they were tall, he wrote, like date palms with ruddy skin. And they were merchants. Their main trade goods were furs, swords, and people. Ibn Fadlan watched them. He documented their lives on the riverbank. He saw how they lived and how they died. He was there when one of their chieftains died. They placed the man in a temporary grave for 10 days while they prepared. They gathered his wealth, they made new clothes for him, and they asked his household who would die with him. And she said she wanted to join her master in the afterlife. Once she volunteered, she could not go back. 2 other enslaved women were assigned to watch her. They followed her everywhere. The preparations began. For days, the girl was treated like a queen. She drank, she sang, and she was given the best of everything. The people of the Rus said she was joyful. On the day of the funeral, they pulled the chieftain's ship onto the shore. They built a platform on it and covered it with silks and cushions. They brought the chieftain out of his grave. He was dressed in his finest clothes, with gold and sable fur. They sat him on the cushions in the pavilion on the ship. They surrounded him with his weapons. They brought bread, meat, and an alcoholic drink called nabidh. Then they brought animals. They killed 2 horses, 2 oxen, a dog, a rooster, and a hen, and threw them into the ship. Finally, it was the girl's turn. She was led to the ship. She took off her bracelets and gave them to the old woman who oversaw the ceremony, the one they called the Angel of Death. She took off her finger rings and gave them to the woman's daughters. Then she was lifted onto the ship, but not allowed to enter the pavilion yet. She was given a cup of nabidh. She sang a song and drank it. The interpreter told Ibn Fadlan she was saying goodbye to her friends. She was given a second cup. She took it and sang for a long time. The old woman urged her to finish. The girl seemed dazed. She was guided into the pavilion where her dead master sat. 6 men went in with her. They laid her down beside the chieftain. Then the ritual was completed. The men came out. The chieftain's closest male relative came forward. He was naked. He walked backward toward the ship, holding a piece of lit wood. He did not look at the ship. He touched the flame to the pyre. Others came forward with their own torches. The wood caught fire quickly. The ship, the pavilion, the man, the girl, and all the offerings were consumed by the flames. A Russ's man stood near Ibn Fadlan. He told the scholar, "You Arabs are fools. You put your dead in the ground where they are eaten by worms. We burn them in an instant, so they go to paradise at once." Ibn Fadlan saw a business transaction. He saw a ritual. But what he documented was something more. He recorded the end of a life that was not considered a life. It was property, an offering, an accessory to a man's death. This was the world of the Rus's Vikings, and this was the world of their slaves. Number 16, the economy ran on human lives. Olaf the Stout was a farmer in Rogaland, Norway, around the year 860. He was not a raider. He never set foot on a longship bound for England. His hands were calloused from the plow, not the sword hilt. But Olaf was a wealthy man. His longhouse was large, his storehouses full. His wealth wasn't measured in the grain he grew or the cattle in his fields. It was measured in people. He owned 12 thralls. The word he used was thrall. It meant a person who was unfree, a piece of property. For Olaf, his thralls were his machinery. 2 of his strongest men, Finn and Canute, spent their days clearing the forest at the edge of his land. They chopped down pine and birch trees, hauled the logs, and dug out the stubborn stumps. This was work that would break a free man's spirit, but it was all they did, day after day. This new land would allow Olaf to plant more barley next season. The men's labor translated directly into future profits. He had paid 3 marks of silver for each of them at the market in Kaupang. A good milking cow cost 1 mark. His thralls were literally worth more than his livestock, but their legal status was the same. 4 of the women worked in the longhouse. They ground grain for hours every day, pushing the heavy top stone of a quern back and forth. The repetitive motion wore down their bodies. They wove wool into cloth, cooked the meals, and served Olaf and his family. Their labor was constant, from before the sun rose to long after it set. One of them, Runa, was particularly skilled at weaving. The fine cloth she produced was not for the household. Olaf sold it to a passing trader for a small amount of silver. Her skill became his profit. The rest of his thralls worked the fields, tended the livestock, and did whatever was needed. They were his workforce, his capital investment. When his neighbor Eric wanted to build a new boat, he didn't have enough thralls for the heavy logging work. So Eric leased 2 of Olaf's thralls for a season. The price was a portion of Eric's next harvest. People were rented out like oxen. This was normal. The entire Viking economy was built on this foundation. The great trading hubs like Hedeby in Denmark or Birka in Sweden were not just markets for amber and furs. They were massive slave markets. A trader could arrive with a cargo of captured people from Ireland or the Slavic lands, or he could sell them for Arabic silver known as dirhams, which flowed into Scandinavia from the east. The silver acquired through the sale of human beings was the currency that fueled everything. A man could use it to buy a better sword, a bigger ship, or more land. He could use it to secure political alliances or pay fines. The sagas, the great stories of the Vikings, talk openly about this. They mention thralls as casually as they mention swords. In one story, a man named Hoskelder travels to a market and buys a woman for 3 marks of silver. He considers it a high price, but he pays it. This wasn't a shameful secret. It was a routine business transaction, the cornerstone of their prosperity. Olaf, the Stout, never raided a village. He never had to. The raiders brought the product to the market. Men like Olaf bought it. They were the end consumers in a supply chain that started with violence and ended with the quiet, relentless labor that built the Viking world. Without his 12 thralls, Olaf would have been a poor man with a small plot of land. With them, he was a powerful chieftain. His status, his comfort, his future, it was all built on the lives of people he owned. Number 15. The slave routes were global highways. In the year 885, a boy named Stanimir lived in a small village on the banks of the Dnieper River, deep in what is now Ukraine. His world was small. It was the forest, the river, and the fields his family worked. That changed the day the Russes came. They were not raiding for gold, they were raiding for people. Stanimir was strong and healthy. He was rounded up with dozens of others from his village and the surrounding area. His family was scattered. He never saw them again. His journey began on a small river boat. He was tied to other captives. They were poled and paddled down smaller rivers until they reached the Great Dnieper. There they were loaded onto larger ships, part of a merchant fleet controlled by the Russes. These were the same ships that could cross open seas, but here they were navigating a treacherous river. Stanimir watched the landscape change. The forests grew denser, the river grew wider and more powerful. The Rus's merchants called this route the road from the Varangians to the Greeks. It was a highway of trade. They traveled south. The most dangerous part was the Dnieper Rapids. At each of the 7 major rapids, everyone had to get out. The cargo, including the enslaved people, was unloaded and forced to march along the riverbank. The Russes had to drag their heavy ships overland to bypass the churning water. It was grueling work. The captives were watched closely by armed guards. Any attempt to escape into the dense woods would be met with a swift death. Stanimir saw one man try. He didn't get far. After the rapids, the journey continued to the Black Sea. Stanimir, who had only ever known a river, saw the endless water of the sea for the first time. It was terrifying. The fleet sailed along the coast, heading for the greatest city in the world, Constantinople, which the Russes called Miklagard. When they arrived, the city was a shock of stone walls, massive buildings, and a crush of people speaking languages he couldn't understand. Stanimir was taken to a market. He was inspected like an animal, his teeth were checked, his muscles felt. He was sold to a Byzantine merchant. The Rus traders who had captured him received Byzantine silk and silver coins for him. They would take these goods back north, up the same river, to trade for more furs and more people. They were the middlemen in a vast network. This eastern route was just one of many. Vikings in the west had their own highways. They raided the coasts of Ireland, Scotland, and England. And Dublin, a city founded by Vikings, became one of the largest slave markets in Western Europe. An Irish man or woman captured in a coastal raid could be sold in Dublin, transported to a Viking settlement in Iceland, or even sold onward to traders in France or Spain. There was a northern route too. Norwegian Vikings traded with and exacted tribute from the Sami people of northern Scandinavia. This tribute often included furs, but sometimes it included people. There was also a massive flow of people from the Slavic lands, the Sakaliba, as the Arab traders called them, west across the Baltic Sea to markets like Hedeby. Stanimir's journey was not unique. He was one of thousands upon thousands. He was a product, moved along a supply chain. These slave routes were the arteries of the Viking Age. They connected Scandinavia to the wealth of the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate. The silver dirhams found in hoards all over Sweden were the payment for countless lives, like Stanimir's, moved across continents, their pasts erased, their futures sold to the highest bidder. Number 14, anyone could be taken. In the year 937, a Viking chieftain from Iceland named Höskuldur Dalla Kolsson traveled to Norway to buy timber, a rare commodity, on his home island. While there, he attended a great market. A merchant was selling a group of 12 enslaved women. One of them stood apart. She was silent and beautiful. The merchant told Höskuldur she was mute. The price for a normal thrall was 1 mark of silver. The merchant, Gilly, was asking for 3 marks for this woman, an enormous sum. He claimed she was special. Höskuldur was intrigued. He paid the 3 marks of silver and took the woman back to Iceland with him. For a year, she did not speak a single word. She did her work as a concubine and household servant in silence. She gave birth to a son, whom Höskuldur named Olaf. One day, when the boy was 2 years old, Höskuldur overheard the woman talking to him. She was speaking a language he did not understand. He confronted her. She finally spoke to him, revealing her name was Melkorka and the language she spoke was Irish. She was not mute. She had simply chosen silence as her only form of defiance. She then told him her story. She was the daughter of an Irish king named Mjorturtak. She had been captured in a Viking raid when she was 15 years old. Her royal status meant nothing to her captors. She was just another piece of valuable cargo. She was sold, transported, and eventually ended up at the market in Norway, where Höskuldur found her. Her silence had been a shield, a way to preserve a small part of herself in a world that had taken everything else. The story of Melkorka, recorded in the Icelandic Laxdæla saga, shows a critical truth about Viking slavery. It was not just the poor or the weak who were taken. Anyone was a target. A king's daughter had the same fate as a farmer's son. Status, wealth, and power in one's homeland provided no protection from a Viking raid. In fact, high-status individuals might have been specifically targeted because they could potentially be ransomed. But ransom was a complicated process. It was often easier and more profitable to simply sell the captive into the general slave trade. Archaeological evidence supports this. In 2009, a mass grave was discovered at Ridgeway Hill in Dorset, England. It contained the bodies of 54 young men, all beheaded. Isotope analysis of their teeth showed they were not locals. They came from Scandinavia, they were Vikings, but one man among them was from the Arctic or subarctic region, possibly from northern Norway or beyond. The burial was dated to between 970 and 1025. This was a crew of Vikings executed by the local Anglo-Saxons. The presence of a man from so far north in a crew raiding England shows how mixed these groups were. But it also works in reverse. A person from any land the Vikings reached could be incorporated into their world, often by force. A raid was a moment of violent chaos. In that chaos, social structures collapsed. A princess became a commodity. A skilled craftsman became an anonymous laborer. The only thing that mattered was a person's health and strength, factors that determined their price at market. Melkorka was lucky in a sense. Her son, Olaf the Peacock, grew up to be a great chieftain in his own right. and he treated his mother with respect. But her story is the exception. For every Melkorka whose name we know, there were thousands of others, princes, priests, merchants, and nobles, whose identities were erased the moment they were put in chains. Their pasts were wiped clean, and they became simply thralls. Number 13, you were born into chains. On a farm in Iceland's Skagafjordur Valley, around the year 1010, a woman named Yrsa gave birth to a son. She was a thrall. The father was the owner of the farm, a free man named Bjarni. Yrsa had been born in this very long house. Her mother had been captured in a raid on Scotland some 30 years earlier. Yrsa had never known freedom, and neither would her son. The child was not considered Bjarni's heir. He was not part of the family, and he was, from the moment he drew his first breath, a thrall. He was Bjarni's property. His value was calculated even as a baby. He represented a future laborer, a new asset for the farm. His fate was sealed by his mother's status. This was codified in Norse law. The Icelandic law code, the Gragas, was explicit on this point. Gengu alir meniet til modurskinar thought their seo frialsbornir and thralar ekki. All men follow the mother's line, even if they are freeborn, but not thralls. A more direct passage stated that a child of a free man and a thrall woman was a thrall. The legal status was, passed down through the maternal line. This was a practical and brutal rule for the slave-owning class. It ensured a self-perpetuating labor force. The children of their enslaved women automatically became their property, increasing their wealth without any additional cost. The child would grow up in the longhouse, but his world was entirely different from that of Bjarni's freeborn children. He would learn to work as soon as he could walk. He would be given simple tasks, fetching water, tending the fire, watching the sheep. As he grew, the work would become harder. He would join the other thralls in the fields, the quarry, or the forge. He would learn that his purpose was to serve the family that his father led, but to which he could never belong. His name would not be a family name. He might be called simply Svein Boy or given a functional name. He would have no inheritance rights. He could not own property. If he was injured, compensation would be paid to Bjarni. If he was killed, his killer would owe Bjarni his value in silver. His life was legally defined by his owner's property rights. This created a permanent, hereditary underclass. Generations of people could be born, live their entire lives, and die on the same farm, never knowing anything but servitude. While the sagas are full of stories of ambitious men rising in status, this path was almost entirely closed to those born into thraldom. They were trapped by the circumstances of their birth. Yrsa's son might have looked at Bjarni's other children, his own half-siblings, and seen the vast gulf that separated them. They had a future. They could marry, inherit land, and become respected members of the community. His future was to work until he was no longer useful. This was not a matter of chance or bad luck. It was the law. It was the structure of their society. The system wasn't just about capturing people, it was about breeding them, ensuring that the supply of unpaid labor never ran out. The chains were not always made of iron. Sometimes they were forged by law and blood, passed from a mother to her child. Number 12, freedom was a business transaction. Kari was old, he was nearly 60, and his body ached from a lifetime of hard labor. He had been a thrall on the same Norwegian farm since he was a boy, captured in a raid on the English coast. He had served his master Leif and Leif's father before him. He had overseen the other thralls, managed the harvest, and was trusted more than any other unfree person on the land. But he was still unfree. He dreamed of dying a free man. For years, Kari had hoarded every tiny opportunity. Leif allowed his thralls to work for themselves on holidays, a common practice. Kari would carve wooden bowls and sell them at the local market. He would mend tools for neighbors. Slowly, coin by coin, he built a small purse of silver. He was saving up for the biggest purchase of his life himself. The process of buying one's freedom was called leasing. It was not a right, it was a privilege granted by the master. The master set the price. For Kari, Leif set a price of 2 marks of silver, the standard value of a healthy male thrall. It was a fortune that had taken Kari decades to save. When he finally had the money, the ceremony took place. This wasn't a private affair. It required public witness to be legally binding. Leif hosted a freedom feast. He invited his neighbors and kinsmen. In front of everyone, Leif took the silver from Kari. Then he took Kari by the hand and led him into the community. He declared that Kari was no longer a thrall, but a Leizingi, a freedman. The witnesses at the feast confirmed the transaction. Kari was, for the first time in 50 years, legally free, but his freedom was conditional. He was not a freeborn man. He was in a new social class, a sort of half-freedom. As a Leizingi, Kari still had obligations to his former master. He owed Leif loyalty. In any dispute, he was expected to side with Leif's family. He had to show them deference and respect. Part of the deal was that he would continue to work on the farm, now for a small wage, until a suitable replacement could be found. More importantly, his legal standing was weak. His wergild, the blood price paid to his family if he were killed, was only half that of a freeborn man. He could not hold a position of authority in the community, and if he died without heirs, his property, what little he might acquire, would revert not to the community, but to his former master Leif. His freedom was a legal status, but it did not erase the social stain of having been a thrall. This system was designed to benefit the master class. It provided a powerful incentive for thralls to be loyal and hardworking, offering a glimmer of hope for freedom. It also allowed a master to cash in on an aging thrall who was becoming less productive, like Kari. Leif got a lump sum of silver and retained a loyal dependent. For Kari, the feeling was complex. He was free. No one could buy or sell him, but he was not equal. He lived in the same hut, did much of the same work, and was still bound by a web of obligations to the man who had once owned him. He had purchased his legal personhood, but he could never purchase the status of being born free. His freedom was not a gift or a right. It was a carefully calculated transaction that reinforced the power of the master, even as it seemed to release the slave. Number 11, you were not a person, you were property. In the year 990, in the Gulating district of western Norway, two farmers had a dispute. One farmer, Gunnar, owned a thrall named Arn. The other farmer, Magnus, owned a particularly aggressive ox. One day, the ox gored Arn in the leg, injuring him so badly that he could no longer work in the fields. Gunnar was furious. He took the case to the local thing, the Assembly of Free Men, who judged legal disputes. At the thing, Gunnar did not argue for Arn's pain or suffering. He did not speak of Arn's lost future. He spoke of his own financial loss. Arn was his property, an asset worth 2 marks of silver. Magnus's ox had damaged this property. Therefore, Magnus owed him compensation. The lawmen at the thing consulted the Gulating law code. The laws were clear. They had specific sections detailing compensation for injuries to livestock and thralls, often in the same passages. The law stated the compensation for an injury that made a thrall unable to work. Magnus was ordered to pay Gunnar a sum of silver equivalent to the thrall's lost value. Arn was not a party in this dispute. He was the subject of it. He was not asked to testify. The law codes were explicit that a thrall's testimony was worthless in court unless it was a confession extracted from him. He had no legal voice. His body was the damaged object at the center of the case, like a broken cart or a lame horse. The payment went to his owner, not to him. There was no concept of compensation for his suffering or his permanent disability. So this principle extended to the ultimate crime killing. If a man killed another man's thrall, it was not treated as murder. It was treated as property destruction. The killer did not face execution or outlawry as he might for killing a free man. He simply had to pay the thrall's owner the standard price for a thrall, the 3Ls gildi. The saga literature is filled with casual mentions of this. A character might kill a thrall in a fit of anger, and the consequence is a simple payment to the owner. It was a fine, not a punishment for taking a human life. This legal status shaped every aspect of a thrall's existence. They could be bought and sold at will. They could be included in inheritance, passed from a father to a son along with the farm and the cattle. They could be gambled away. A master had the right to punish his thralls as he saw fit, While killing one's own thrall was sometimes frowned upon as a waste of a good asset, legal repercussions were minimal or non-existent. The language of the law reinforced this dehumanization. A thrall was not a madur, a man or person, in the full legal sense. He was a possession. This legal framework was the bedrock that allowed the entire system to function. It stripped a whole class of people of their humanity in the eyes of the law, making it possible to treat them as objects, tools, and commodities. Arn, with his ruined leg, would have to live with the consequences of the ox's attack for the rest of his life. But in the eyes of the law, the case was closed. Property had been damaged, and the owner had been paid. Number 10. The work would break you. Einar was a thrall on a large farmstead in Jutland, Denmark, around 950. His day began before the sun. His first task was to muck out the byre where the cattle had spent the night. It was heavy, foul-smelling work. And after that, he joined the other male thralls for the main labor of the day. For the past year, they had been clearing a new field from the forest. This meant felling massive oak trees with iron axes. The work was slow and dangerous. A misplaced swing or a falling branch could mean serious injury or death. Once a tree was down, the work had just begun. The trunk had to be sawed and split for timber. The massive stump had to be dug out of the ground with spades and levers. It was a battle against roots and rocks that took several men days to win for a single stump. Einar's back was a constant knot of pain. His hands were a mass of calluses and old scars. The food was meager. He was given a portion of porridge and sometimes a piece of coarse bread. Meat was a rarity reserved for the master's family or special feasts where the thralls might get the leftover scraps. This poor diet, combined with the relentless physical labor, took a toll. Einar was often sick, but being sick was not an option. If he could stand, he had to work. Archaeological evidence from Viking age burial sites paints a grim picture that supports this reality. Skeletons of individuals believed to have been thralls show signs of a life of extreme physical hardship. Analysis of their bones reveals high rates of degenerative joint disease, especially in the spine and major joints, even in relatively young individuals. This is the mark of years of heavy lifting and repetitive strain. Many skeletons show evidence of healed fractures, injuries that were left to mend on their own without proper care. There are also signs of malnutrition, such as lines of arrested growth in the bone's Harris lines, indicating periods of severe hunger or illness during childhood. The average height of these individuals was often shorter than that of those buried in wealthier graves, another sign of a life of deprivation. The work varied by season, but was always hard. In the spring, it was plowing the heavy soil with an ard, a simple plow that had to be forced through the earth by the combined strength of a man and an ox. In the summer, it was the back-breaking work of haymaking, cutting acres of hay with a scythe, and then raking and stacking it. In the autumn, it was the harvest, followed by quarrying stone for new walls or buildings. For women, the labor was different, but no less grueling. Grinding grain on a hand-cranked quernstone was a daily task that took hours and put immense strain on the arms, shoulders, and back. Skeletal remains of women from this period often show wear on the knees and spine consistent with this kind of work. They also processed wool, which involved cleaning, carding, spinning, and weaving, all physically demanding tasks. This was a world without machinery. Everything was powered by muscle, and most of that muscle belonged to thralls. They built the longhouses, cleared the forests that became farmland, and produced the food and cloth that sustained the society. The Viking Age was an era of expansion and construction, but the foundation of it all was the broken bodies and shortened lives of people like Einar, whose relentless, unrewarded labor made everything else possible. Number 9. They took your name, they took your past. In 878, a young man from a village in Northumbria was taken in a raid. His name was Ceolred. He was a farmer married with a young child. In the chaos of the Viking attack, he was clubbed, bound, and thrown into a longship with other captives. When he was eventually sold at a market in Denmark, his life as Seolraid ended. His new master looked at him, a strong but defeated man, and gave him a new name, Kor. It meant Koel or black, perhaps a comment on his dark hair. The act of renaming was a fundamental part of the process of enslavement. It was a powerful tool of dehumanization. A name connects a person to their family, their community, their ancestors, and their god. By stripping Seolred of his name, his master severed all those connections. The name Seolred carried a history and a lineage. The name Kolor meant he was a possession. This was a common practice. Thralls in the Viking world were often given simple monosyllabic Norse names. Sometimes these names were descriptive, like Kolor or Jotor ugly or Hrapr quick. Other times they were simply common Norse names, a way of marking the thrall as belonging to this new culture. The Irish Princess Melkorka was a rare exception. She managed to keep her name a secret, preserving her identity. Most were not so fortunate. The sagas are full of thralls with generic or even insulting names. In Eagle's saga, we meet thralls named Scoffscrape and Grofdig. These are not names, they are job descriptions, they reduce the person to their function. It was a constant daily reminder of their lowly status. You know, every time someone called out Kolor, Seolred was reminded that he was no longer himself, he was someone else's property. This erasure of identity made it easier for the slave-owning society to function. It helped distance the masters from the humanity of the people they owned. It also served a practical purpose. It made it harder for escaped thralls to find their way home. A man named Kor, speaking broken Norse, would have a much harder time finding passage back to Northumbria than a man who could identify himself as Seolred from a specific village. Over time, the old identity would fade. The memories of home, of family, would become distant and painful. The new name would become a reality. The children of Coral, born into slavery, would never have known his original name. They would be the children of Cole, the thrall, with no connection to a past in another land. The cultural and personal heritage of an entire lineage could be wiped out in a single generation. This loss of identity was one of the most profound and cruel aspects of Viking slavery. It was a form of psychological bondage that went hand in hand with physical chains. It aimed to destroy a person's sense of self, to make them believe they were nothing more than what their master told them they were. Seolraid, the Northumbrian farmer, ceased to exist. In his place was Kor, a tool, an object, a thrall, whose past had been deliberately and systematically erased. Number 8, your life could end as a spectacle. The death of the Russis chieftain on the Volga in 922, witnessed by Ibn Fadlan, was a clear case of a human sacrifice where an enslaved girl was killed to accompany her master. But this was not an isolated practice confined to Vikings in the East. Evidence from the heart of the Viking world in Scandinavia suggests that the lives of thralls could be ended for ritual purposes, turning their deaths into a public spectacle that affirmed the power of their masters. The most famous and debated example is the Oseberg ship burial in Norway. Discovered in 1904, this lavishly decorated ship was buried in a mound around the year 834. Inside were the skeletons of 2 women. One was older, between 60 and 70, and her bones showed signs of a comfortable life, but also a serious illness. The other woman was younger, around 50. For a long time, it was assumed they were a queen and her high-ranking attendant. But modern analysis has raised a more sinister possibility. The younger woman's DNA suggests she had a more common background. Her collarbone was broken, an injury that would have taken weeks to heal and been very painful. Was she a queen's companion who chose to follow her into death? Or was she a high-status thrall, a servant sacrificed to continue her duties in the afterlife? The answer is uncertain, but the possibility that one of these women was an unwilling participant in this grand funeral is very real. Her death was part of the immense wealth and power being displayed in the burial. She was, in effect, another grave good, like the ornate carvings and silk tapestries buried with the ship. Other archaeological finds are even more suggestive. In a handful of graves across Scandinavia, individuals have been found buried in ways that suggest a ritualistic killing. Some bodies are buried face down, some are decapitated with the head placed between the legs. While there could be many reasons for such burials, one interpretation is that these were thralls or captives killed as part of a funeral rite. The sagas, while written later, contain echoes of this practice. There are stories of kings or great chieftains whose funerals include the sending of servants with them. The phrase often used is that the thralls went into the mound with their master. It's often presented as a voluntary act of loyalty, but the line between voluntary and coerced in such a society was thin to non-existent. A thrall had no power to refuse such a request. These sacrifices served a purpose. They were a demonstration of the deceased's immense power and wealth. To be able to dispose of human life so casually, to send people to their deaths, simply to serve as an entourage in the afterlife was the ultimate status symbol. It sent a clear message to the living community about the power of the chieftain's family. It reinforced the social order, reminding everyone that the lives of the unfree were not their own. They belonged to their masters in life and even in death. The end of a thrall's life was not always a quiet death from old age or hard labor. It could be a public, ritualized event, a final act of service, where their very life was the offering. Number 7, resistance had a final price. In the year 999, Jarl Hakon Sigurdsson was the ruler of Norway. He was a powerful but cruel man. Eventually, the people turned against him, and he was forced to flee with his last remaining loyal follower, a thrall named Kark. They hid in a pigsty at the home of one of Hakon's old friends. Hakon knew his enemies were searching for him and that there was a large bounty on his head. He became paranoid, unable to sleep. He spoke to Kark. He told him they had been born on the same night and that their deaths would not be far apart. And Kark was terrified. He saw an opportunity. While the Jarl slept, Kark took a knife and killed him. He then cut off his master's head and took it to Hakon's enemies, expecting the promised reward and his freedom. The story told by the Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson in the Heimskringla did not end well for Kark. Instead of being hailed as a hero, he was seized. The new ruler of Norway, Olaf Tryggvason, had Kark's head cut off as well. He was rewarded not with freedom, but with death. The message was clear: a thrall's betrayal of his master, even a hated master, would not be tolerated. The social order had to be maintained. This story illustrates the near impossibility of successful resistance for a thrall. The entire system of power was stacked against them. Open rebellion was suicidal. An individual act of defiance was almost equally so. A thrall who struck his master could be legally killed on the spot by anyone present. Running away was a desperate gamble. An escaped thrall was an outlaw. They had no legal rights, no protection. Anyone could kill them without penalty. In fact, people were often rewarded for capturing or killing runaways. The landscape itself was an enemy. In the dense forests and mountains of Norway, or the barren highlands of Iceland, surviving alone was a monumental challenge. Yet, they did resist. They ran. They broke tools. They worked slowly. And sometimes they fought back. Runestones, the public monuments of the Viking Age, occasionally hint at this. The Hagenvik stone in Norway from around the 4th or 5th century, but relevant to the cultural mindset, has a cryptic inscription that some have interpreted as a magical text, possibly related to protecting against rebellious thralls. More directly, some legal texts mention fines for sheltering a runaway. The fact that these laws existed proves that people were running away. The most common form of resistance was likely passive and quiet. It was the stolen moments of rest, the feigned illness, the deliberate misunderstanding of an order. It was Melkorka's silence, a refusal to give her captors all of herself. These small acts were not a path to freedom, but they were a way to assert a sliver of humanity in a dehumanizing system. But for those who chose active resistance, the price was almost always death. Kark's story is a powerful parable. He did what many thralls must have dreamed of doing. He killed his oppressor. But in doing so, he broke the most fundamental rule of their society. He, a piece of property, had destroyed his owner. The system could not allow that act to be rewarded. His execution was not just about him, it was a warning to every other thrall. It reinforced the chains, both visible and invisible, that held their world together. Resistance was possible, but freedom was rarely the outcome. Number 6, freedom didn't mean equality. Thorir was a Leysingi, a freedman. He had bought his own freedom from his master in Iceland a decade earlier, around the year 1020. He was no longer a thrall, he was a free man, but every day he was reminded that he was not equal to the freeborn. He had managed to acquire a small plot of land, enough to support his family, but his farm was on the margins, on rocky soil that the established families didn't want. When he went to the Althing, the great assembly of Iceland, he could listen to the proceedings, but he could not vote or speak in the law court. Those rights were reserved for chieftains and landowners of a certain status, a status he could never achieve. His past was a permanent shadow. His neighbors knew he had been a thrall. In any dispute, their word carried more weight than his. The law itself made this clear. The wergild, the price set on a person's life, was the ultimate measure of their worth in society. The wergild for a freeborn farmer was a substantial sum, enough to cripple the killer's family. The wergild for a Leysingi like Thorir was only half that. His life was legally worth less. He was also still tied to the family of his former master, Ketil. The law and custom demanded that he show them deference. When Ketil's son was involved in a blood feud, Thorir was expected to join his cause, to fight and risk his life for the family that had once owned him. This obligation was called filja, or following. Refusing was unthinkable. It would make him an outcast. Even his marriage prospects were limited. A freeborn woman's family would be reluctant to marry her to a former thrall. Such a marriage would be seen as a step down for the family, so Thorir had married the daughter of another Leysingi. Their children would be freeborn, but the stigma of their grandfather's status would linger. It would take generations for a family to wash away the stain of thraldom. This social and legal limbo was the reality for all freed slaves. The act of manumission did not wipe the slate clean. It simply moved a person from one category of unfreedom to a category of limited freedom, right? The freedman class acted as a buffer between the enslaved and the free, reinforcing the social hierarchy. The sagas reflect this reality. Freedmen often appear as loyal retainers to their former masters, still operating within their sphere of influence. They are rarely independent actors. Their loyalty is their primary virtue. This suggests that even in the stories the Vikings told about themselves, the idea of a thrall becoming a true equal was difficult to imagine. Thorir's freedom was real. He could not be sold. His children were born free, but it was a qualified second-class freedom. He had escaped the legal status of property, but he could never escape the social memory of it. He was a constant reminder of the rigid structure of his society, a world where the circumstances of your birth or your capture defined you for life and even beyond. Number 5, an island nation built on stolen genes. The settlement of Iceland began around the year 874. The traditional story, told in the Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, is one of noble Norwegian chieftains fleeing the tyranny of King Harald Finehair. They packed up their families and their longships and sailed west to find a new empty land where they could be free. It is a powerful foundation myth, a story of brave pioneers and political freedom, but it leaves out the most crucial part of the story: who else was on those ships? For centuries, this heroic narrative was accepted. But in the 21st century, scientists developed a new way to read history, not from ancient books, but from the DNA of the living population. Genetic studies of the modern Icelandic people revealed a startling and dark truth that completely upended the old story. Researchers looked at 2 types of DNA. They studied the Y chromosome, which is passed down from father to son, tracing the paternal lineage. They also studied mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, which is passed down from a mother to all her children, tracing the maternal lineage. The results were stark. The Y chromosome DNA of Icelandic men was overwhelmingly Scandinavian, just as the sagas suggested. About 80% of the founding male population came from Norway and other parts of Scandinavia, but the mtDNA told a very different story. The maternal lineages were not primarily Scandinavian. Over 60% of the founding female population's mtDNA was of Gaelic origin from Ireland and Scotland. The numbers didn't lie. The founding population of Iceland was not made up of Scandinavian families. It was made up of Scandinavian men and Gaelic women. There is no historical record of a mass, peaceful migration of women from the British Isles to Iceland. There is, however, an extensive historical and archaeological record of Vikings raiding Ireland and Scotland constantly throughout this period. Dublin was a Viking-run slave trading hub. The Annals of Ulster, an Irish chronicle, records raid after raid, with the Vikings carrying off a great host of women and other captives. The genetic evidence forces a new, darker reading of the settlement of Iceland. The Norwegian chieftains did not bring their wives. They brought enslaved women, they raided the coasts of the British Isles, captured young women and girls, and transported them to this new, remote island to be their wives, concubines, and servants. These women were the founding mothers of Iceland. This explains characters like Melkorka, the Irish princess bought by Höskuldur. Her story was not an exotic exception, it was the norm. The vast majority of the first generation of women in Iceland were unfree, brought there against their will, cut off from their homes and families by 1,000 miles of cold ocean. They were forced to bear children for their captors. This genetic legacy is a silent testament to the nature of Viking expansion. It was not just about exploration or a search for land. It was fundamentally tied to the slave trade. The settlement of an entire country was made possible by a systematic, large-scale campaign of capturing women. The nation of Iceland, with its rich literary culture and proud history, was built on a foundation of stolen genes and the forced servitude of thousands of unnamed Gaelic women. The story is written not just in the sagas, but in the very blood of the Icelandic people today. Number 4, women's lives were a different kind of unfree. Astrid was an enslaved woman in a longhouse in Birka, Sweden, around the year 900. Her life was defined by the walls of that building. While the male thralls worked outside in the fields and forests, her domain was the domestic sphere. It was a world of constant, repetitive labor under the watchful eye of her master's wife. Her day started in the dark, grinding barley and rye in a heavy stone quern. The work was exhausting, a steady, rhythmic strain on her back and arms. After that, she would help prepare the morning meal, tending the central fire, cooking porridge in a large iron pot. She served the food to her master's family, but she ate only after they were finished, and only what was left. Her main task, the one that consumed most of her hours, was textile production. She had to process raw, greasy wool, cleaning it, carding it to straighten the fibers, then spinning it into yarn with a drop spindle. The spindle was always in her hand, even as she walked or did other small tasks. The demand for woolen cloth was endless. It was needed for clothes, for blankets, and for the sails of the ships. A single ship's sail required a huge amount of wool and years of labor from several women. The cloth Astrid produced was a vital economic product for the household. She lived in close quarters with the family who owned her. She slept on a simple bench by the wall, often near the animals who were sometimes brought inside during the coldest parts of winter. She had no privacy, she was a constant presence in the most intimate spaces of her owners' lives. She helped the master's wife give birth. She cared for the freeborn children, her own feelings and attachments to them completely irrelevant. While male thralls were often valued for their brute strength, female thralls were valued for their domestic skills and their potential to produce more thralls. Their lives were a different kind of unfree. Their work was less likely to be immediately fatal than felling trees, but it was a relentless, lifelong grind that wore down the body. The constant presence in the home also meant they were subject to the whims and moods of their owners in a more immediate and constant way. The archaeological record gives us glimpses into their lives. The discovery of weaving tools, spindle whorls, and loom weights in graves shows the importance of textile work. In some cases, enslaved women were buried at the feet of their mistresses, a final sign of their subservient status. For an enslaved woman, there was no escape. Running away was even harder for a woman than for a man. Her world was the longhouse, the center of the family's power. She was trapped in the heart of her own oppression. Her labor was essential. The Viking household, with its need for food, clothing, and warmth, could not have functioned without the silent, unending work of women like Astrid. She was the engine that kept the domestic world running, an engine powered by servitude. Number 3, poverty could cost you your freedom. Sven was a free man. He was a carl, a farmer in the Norwegian region of Trondelag in the late 10th century. He owned a small patch of land, a cow, and a few goats. But for 2 years in a row, the harvest had been poor. A long, cold spring had delayed planting, and an early frost had killed much of the grain. His family was starving. He had no silver to buy food from his wealthier neighbors. His neighbor was a powerful chieftain named Einar. Einar had large productive fields and storehouses full of grain from previous years. Sven went to Einar for help. Einar agreed to give him enough grain to survive the winter, but it was not a gift, it was a loan. Sven had to pledge his land as collateral. The next year, the weather was no better. Sven's harvest failed again. He could not repay the loan. According to the law and custom, Einar now had a right to his land. But Einar had plenty of land. What he needed was more labor. He made Sven a new offer. To settle the debt, Sven could sell himself into thraldom. This was a terrible choice. He would lose his freedom, his status, his rights as a man, but the alternative was to watch his children starve. With a heavy heart, Sven agreed. In a formal proceeding witnessed by others, Sven declared himself Einar's thrall. This was debt bondage, a form of voluntary slavery. This was not an uncommon path to thraldom. While violent raids were a major source of slaves, the Viking world also created its own unfree population through debt and poverty. Life for a small independent farmer was precarious. A few bad harvests, the death of a key animal, or a sudden illness could push a family to the brink. For those with no safety net, selling a child, or even oneself, into servitude was a desperate survival strategy. The law recognized this. There were provisions for how a person could enter into thraldom willingly. It was a legal contract, albeit a one-sided one. The person gained survival in exchange for their freedom. Once a thrall, Sven was no different from a person captured in a raid. He lost all his property. He worked in Einar's fields, doing the same work he had done on his own land, but now the fruits of his labor belonged to his master. His children, depending on the terms of the agreement, might also become thralls. This highlights the thin line that could separate the free poor from the enslaved. The social structure was a pyramid. At the top were the powerful jarls and chieftains. In the middle were the free farmers, the carls. But the base of the pyramid was the thralls. A free man like Sven was always at risk of slipping down to the bottom. This created a society with a constant undercurrent of fear and insecurity. It also ensured a steady supply of labor for the wealthy. Chieftains like Einar could consolidate their power by preying on the misfortunes of their poorer neighbors, turning their debt into a permanent source of labor. Sven's story was a quiet tragedy, a fall from freedom to bondage, not through the violence of a raid, but through the slow, crushing pressure of poverty and hunger. Number 2, their stories are hidden in the landscape. A traveler driving through the north of England today might pass a village called Walton or Walby. They might not think twice about the name. But these names are echoes of a forgotten history. The Old English word for a foreigner, particularly a Celt, a Welshman, or Briton, was wall. Over time, this word also came to mean slave or serf. A place named Walton was likely a tun, or settlement, of the Walsam, a place where the local Anglo-Saxon or Viking lord housed his Celtic slaves. The people themselves are gone, but their presence is etched into the map. This is just one way the story of Viking slavery is hidden in plain sight. The historical record of the thralls is faint because they were not the ones writing the histories or carving the runestones. Their voices are almost entirely absent. To find them, you have to look for their shadows, for the traces they left behind in the world of their masters. Place names are a powerful source. In Iceland, there is a place called Íragurdi, which means Irish enclosure. It suggests a settlement of Irish people who were almost certainly there as thralls in the early years of settlement. The sagas mention a thrall of a famous settler named Ingolfur Arnarsson. His name was Karl, and he was said to have run away. The bay, where he was later killed, is named Karlsarvagur after him. The language itself holds clues. The Old Norse word for a female thrall was ambat. This word is not of Germanic origin. It is a loanword from Celtic. The very word the Vikings used for a female slave was borrowed from the people they most commonly enslaved in the West. It speaks volumes about who was doing the domestic work in Viking households. Even the grand monuments of the age tell a story of the enslaved, if you know how to read it. A great runestone, carved with intricate patterns and proud text, tells of a chieftain's accomplishments. But who quarried the stone? Who hauled the multi-ton rock into place? Who prepared the surface for the carver? The answer is almost certainly thralls. Their labor created the very monuments that celebrated the men who owned them, yet their own names are never mentioned. The great Viking fortresses, like the Trelleborg-style ring forts in Denmark, were massive construction projects. They required the felling of thousands of oak trees and an immense amount of earth moving. This work was too vast to have been done by free farmers who also had their own lands to tend. It points to a large, organized, and unfree labor force. The story of the thralls is not a separate story from the story of the Vikings. It is the hidden foundation of it, the wealth that paid for the beautiful jewelry, the power that built the fortresses, the labor that raised the runestones. It all came from the enslaved. They are the silent figures in the background of every saga, the unnamed builders of the world their masters inhabited. Their individual stories are almost all lost, but their collective presence is embedded in the land, the language, and the very achievements of the Viking Age. You just have to know where to look. Number 1, the Vikings, are a myth. The popular image of the Viking is a warrior, a horned helmet which they never wore, a massive axe, a longship cutting through the mist. They are adventurers, explorers, fierce individualists. They are the heroes of television shows and the inspiration for sports team mascots. This image is powerful. It is also a profound distortion. It is a myth that sanitizes the past by ignoring the institution that made the Viking Age possible: slavery. The Viking was not primarily a warrior. He was a farmer and a trader, and his business was, to a very large extent, human trafficking. The raids that are so central to the Viking myth were not just about plunder, about grabbing gold from monasteries. They were, more often than not, slaving expeditions. People were the most valuable commodity. They were self-transporting cargo that could be sold for a massive profit in the markets of Ireland, Scandinavia, or the great empires to the south and east. Without slavery, the Viking Age, as we know it, would not have happened. Consider the expansion. The settlement of Iceland, a cornerstone of the Viking story, was accomplished by Norse men bringing enslaved Celtic women. Without that forced reproductive labor, the population would never have been viable. The great river routes through Russia to the Byzantine and Islamic worlds were not just for selling furs. The Russ's Vikings were preeminent slave traders, feeding the massive demand for European slaves in the East. The silver that flowed into Scandinavia, the silver that funded the entire enterprise, was largely payment for people. The society at home was equally dependent on slavery. The farms that supported the population were worked by thralls. The cloth for sails and clothes was woven by thralls. The longhouses and ships were built with the labor of thralls. A chieftain's power and status were measured not just in his silver hoard or the size of his warband, but in the number of people he owned. Slavery wasn't a peripheral part of their world, it was the engine at its very core. To ignore this is to misunderstand who the Vikings were. It is to cherry-pick the exciting parts of the exploration, the battles, and discard the brutal economic and social reality that underpinned it all. The heroic Viking, the free-spirited adventurer, is an incomplete and misleading picture. A more honest picture is of a society that was deeply hierarchical, where the freedom and prosperity of a minority were built directly on the bondage of a majority or a very large minority. The dark truths of Viking slavery are not just grim footnotes to a heroic story, they are the story. They force us to see the Viking Age not as a romantic adventure, but as a complex and often brutal period of history. It was an age of incredible exploration and cultural exchange, but it was financed by a system of human exploitation that was as sophisticated as it was cruel. The real Vikings were not just the men with swords on the prow of the ship. They were also the silent, chained figures in the hold. To forget them is to continue to ignore the truth. The Vikings we think we know are a fantasy. The real story is much darker and much more complicated.